Has this worked? I've pressed. Oh, here we go. Hello, welcome to my quarantine stream today. If this is your first time watching, then welcome. If this is your second time, then welcome back. This is actually the only second time I've done this. Today I'm going to be working on this title screen here, which I started building yesterday. And if you were here yesterday, you might have seen me work through this. This took about 30 minutes to make, and so today I'm going to spend another 30 minutes adding a few more CSS animations. And yeah, let's take a look and see how it goes. So let's start by, how am I going to start? Oh, by the way, this is recorded live. So if you have any questions or if you'd like to see me try anything out, then just put it in the live chat over here and I'll try and give you an answer. Okay, so let me start by, well, we're going to put some animations here. So I'm going to start by fading in the title. So how would we fade in the title using CSS? Oh, this is not working, is it? Huh. It looks to me like this stream is not working. So I don't know. Let me just double check to see if it's working. This is really odd. Oh no, the stream is working. It's just not working for me for some reason. Okay, so I'm gonna try fading this title in. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a CSS animation. Now I already added one CSS animation to this page, which you can see here. And the difference is for this animation that we're using for the clock, it's going to keep going and looping around. Whereas to fade a title in or something like this, we only want that to happen once. So let's start by adding an animation property to the title. So this time we don't want it to loop, we don't want it to be infinite, so we're just going to do one of these. We don't want it to be called rotate, we want it to be called, say, fade in. And we don't want it to take 60 seconds to complete, I just want it to take, like, I don't know, let's try 1 second. So okay, so that's the kind of animation I want, and then I am going to create a fade in keyframes and start by adding the two keyframes, the 0% and 100% one. And so what I want to do to fade in is I'm going to set a property called opacity. So let me actually, before I add this, let me save this and refresh this, and I'll show you what the opacity property does. Because if this is your first time using, or second time using CSS, if you just started watching yesterday, then it probably helps to see what the property does. So there's this property called opacity, and we can apply this to any selector, and you can set it to a value between 0 and 1. Usually it's at 1, so it's usually opaque, whereas if I set opacity to 0, it disappears. And if I set opacity to, say, 0.5, you can see it's kind of like half visible. And just to make this a little bit more obvious, let me add another title over the top, and I'm going to do that by adding a class. Let me say second, and let me use this class to position the second title maybe 100 pixels above where we'd expect. So I'm going to need to set the position relative as well for that. And so you can see here that if we use opacity, then the different colors blend together. So that's basically what opacity does. It lets you set sort of how opaque or how transparent a selector is. So let me remove this and remove this test heading. And what I want to do is I want to fade this text in. So I want to take the opacity from 0 up to 1. and I want to do that in an animation. So to do that, I can set opacity to 0 and the 0% keyframe, and I can set opacity to 1 and 100% keyframe. And so this set of keyframes is called fade in, and what I can do is I can say that I want the title to be animated using that set of keyframes by passing this fade in name to animation. So let me try and load this. There we go, and you see that it dropped back to 0.5 at the end of the animation. That's because I forgot to remove this line. So if I refresh now, okay, that animates in. And you'll notice that at the moment it animates from, it kind of goes smoothly from completely transparent to completely opaque at about the same speed. Now I could change that by saying, for example, that 10% of the way through the animation I want to set it to 0.9. So I want it to really quickly go up to mostly opaque and then just drop off, get that last little bit, go a little bit at a time. So you can see that doesn't look that good, I don't think, but that's one way of doing this. But there's a better way of doing this if you want to sort of gradually fade it in as opposed to going all at the same speed, is to use, instead of doing linear, this is something called a transition function, and there's lots of different transition functions. So one of them is called ease out, and if I do that, this is probably easier to see if I change the duration. So let me change this. So this first number in the animation property, this is the amount of time it takes to do the animation, and then this is sort of way that it animates in, and then this is the different properties which change. So let me change this so it takes 10 seconds for the animation to complete, and you'll see that doing it this way, the change is constant. Whereas if I change to an ease out, let's change to an ease in transition function first, you'll see that that bit at the start, the change is really slow, and the change speeds up towards the end. Or I can set it to ease out, and you'll see that it's a much faster, that first little bit of change, but then towards the end it slows down. So I like to use ease out. I think ease out is a nice one for this kind of thing. Okay. So I've added an animation to the title. I'm not exactly sure what else I want to animate. I think maybe I could animate the clock. I could make it so it sort of drops in or fades in or something. I don't know if it's going to look any good, but let's just try it. So I'm going to add another animation. This one I'm going to make, say, take 2 seconds. Going to put it on ease out. This one I'm going to be like, well, we could let's try making it slide across the screen first. So this animation is going to take 2 seconds. It's going to ease out, and I'm just going to call it slide. So I have to add the keyframes for slide. So keyframes are basically just a list of the different properties which happen at different points in time. So what kind of properties do we want to set for a slide animation? Well, I think the best one to use is called a transform. And transforms are a pretty complicated CSS property. So let's bring up the MDN documentation for transform CSS, and let's have a look at how to use this. So we got transform and then translate. Well, there's lots of different things we can pass to transform. So let's look for, yeah, here we go, transform. So if I'm to set, say, a translate, that will let me slide something over the screen. I can set a scale, already using a rotate for this hand thing. So maybe let's transform. Oh, let's actually. I'm gonna change what I'm doing here. Instead of putting a let's, instead of starting with an animation, let's try and figure out what the transform is that we want to do. So translate, actually you'll see that there's a lot of different types of translate. There's translate 3D, there's translate X, Y, Z. Let's have a look at what these do. So let's start by doing translate X and see what that does. So that moves it to the right. And if I put a minus in front, so I want to translate negative 50% instead, you can see it goes to the left. Translate Y, negative 50%, moves it 50% of the way up. And down, moves it. There we go. And I can also translate not as a percentage, but as a pixel value. So I could translate, say, 300 pixels to the right. I can translate all sorts of ways. So, for example, if I wanted to make a slide animation, maybe what I'd like to do is translate it, the slide to the right. And to do that, I could use these translate transforms. So 0% of, so basically 0% is where the animation starts. So I could start the animation with 0, because, well, that's not going to translate it. And then at the end of the animation, let's translate it 100% to the right. The X is the right. Okay, well that looks dumb. But let's try this. Okay, that's a little bit better, except for the fact that it resets to the start. So maybe what we want to do is start at negative 10%. There we go. So we're kind of moving it in from over here. So actually, if I was to say translate from off the screen, I don't know, I don't like that too much, but maybe one way it could make it look better is by also transforming opacity. So fade it in and move it at the same time. There we go. And another thing you can do is, we're not just stuck with doing, say, a translate, or which is a moving one way or another. We can also scale things at the same time. So I can add this scale code to the transform, and I can scale it from, say, 0.9 or 90%, I think I could even do, to 100%. So let's see what happens. Well, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. Let's try 0.9 and 1.0 instead. There we go. And yeah, you can see here in the documentation for transform that for whatever reason, scale is supposed to be a number and it's a proportion, whereas translate can have percentage values and can have pixel values. I guess that makes kind of sense because the scale is a proportion, whereas translate could be a pixel value, or it could be a percentage of the size or anything. So this kind of makes sense. Okay, let's go back here and let's look at this animation again. Now I think this is scaling up a little bit. It's nice to have like a gradual scale at the same time as the fade and the translate in an animation, but you don't want it to be too much. You just want it to be enough that people can't tell that it's happening. So I mean, I think this translate is too much too. There we go. Okay, so I mean, I kind of like that animation, but well, this is the wrong position for my clock. I think the clock could be bigger, honestly. So I'm gonna, how are we gonna make the clock bigger? I could change all of this. In fact, let's start by changing all of this. We'll make this a bit bigger. Actually, this is the hard way. Let's I mean, I've just showed you how to use scale. So let's actually use scale to make the clock bigger. Now, this is something you wouldn't often do when you're making a web page, because when you transform things by scaling, when you scale things with like a transform, the text also gets bigger and it can sometimes get a little bit harder to read. But since this is just a clock, I think this might be something we can give a shot. So let's try this. And I'm going to have to actually change the animation too. Okay, I think I'm getting somewhere. And okay. You know what though? I'm gonna, instead of using that, I'm actually going to use this. I'm going to set the heights and the widths instead of using a scale, because that way, if I want to reposition this, then I can do it with the animation disabled, like this. Okay, so I don't think I want the clock to be here. I want it to be down here somewhere. So let me do that by positioning. So I'm going to change this to absolute. And what that means is that instead of positioning this clock relative to the previous element on the page, which if we have a look at the code, instead of positioning it relative to the previous element, which is this title, we're going to position it relative to whatever is the parent element, so the one not before it but outside of it, which is this body, because this div is directly inside the body. So I've changed the position. An interesting thing is that even though I've changed the position from relative to absolute, it hasn't actually moved. And the reason is that the default position always stays the same. But if I set, say, top 0, then you'll see now that the top is 0 pixels relative to that outside element. And if I set left 0, then the same thing will happen. If I change position back to relative, then now it's going to be 0 pixels and relative to the title, as you can see. So I think it's just going to be easier to position this if we're working relative to the whole page. So let me change this to relative. And instead of using left, let's use right actually. And instead of using top, let's use bottom. So I've positioned this in the very bottom corner of the page. And let me change the size of this a little bit. I'm just going to adjust all of these numbers a little bit. I've got to adjust where this hand is as well. Okay. So then I would like to move this a little bit away from the edge of the screen. So I'm going to do, say, 20 pixels away from the bottom right. Okay. Now another thing I want to change is, at the moment this title is like a little bit too close to the top left of the page. So maybe I'll use absolute positioning for the title as well, so I can decide where I want that title to be relative to the top left. So let's try putting the title 30 pixels away from the left and 30 pixels away from the top. Well, that's odd. What's happened here? That is odd. I think what's happened here is this, by default, this H1 tag actually has some extra space from whatever is above it, and that is using a property called margin. So if I set the margin to 0, this is going to, yeah, there we go. I wonder how I can show you what this margin does. Well, let me show you by setting the margin actually. If I set the top and left to 0, then this is, you know that this is going to be in the top left of the screen, because you've seen how the clock worked when I put it in the bottom right. So if I refresh that, you'll see that this is in the very top left. And there's actually something called line height as well, which I can adjust even further to get that closer to the top. You know, that's about as close as we can get. Fonts are not always exact, so it's not if you're using text, it's not always going to be right at the top that you've specified. But if I then set the margin to 30 pixels, what's that saying is we want a 30 pixel margin around the text. So if I refresh that, you'll see that now we've got that 30 pixel margin. And I think it's a lot easier to visualize if I add, say, background color. So this is a little bit odd because, well, this box here is positioned at the very top left, but the margin goes around everything, including the background color. Now there's another spacing property that I just want to show you while I'm talking about these spacing properties called padding. And so what padding does is it puts space or padding within this box. So you can think of basically all of these elements as boxes. And so if we add margin, we're putting space around the box. And if we use padding, we're putting space inside the box. Of course, this H1 still has that default margin, so I'm going to set that to 0. I'm going to get rid of this ugly background color. And I'm going to, instead of using padding, I'm just going to position this 30 pixels from the left and 30 pixels from the top, because I think that's a little bit easier to understand. Okay. And also you'll see that as I resize this, because this is positioned from the bottom right, then the clock is moving as well. So that's working, I guess, as you'd expect. Okay. So, now one thing is, this is going to be theoretically a title screen for a video, but videos are usually a specific, they have an aspect ratio, which is, well, for every 16 pixels of width, they have 9 pixels of height. So I'm just eyeballing it. I think it's going to be like this. But the problem is, if we use this aspect ratio, then this clock and the text kind of run into each other. So I've got two options here. I can either give the text a different color, or I can make the clock a little bit smaller. So I'm going to start by giving the text, trying to give the text a different color. Okay. Now you'll see that for whatever reason, the clock is actually being rendered above the text. And this can be fixed. Well, let me explain why that is the case. So you'll see here that the element corresponding to this clock comes after the element corresponding to the title. And because of that, by default, the clock is going to be rendered on top of the title. So if I can fix that by just moving the clock to be before the title. And now the title is on top of this clock. But I think this is better than when they were the same color, but let me try some other colors here. Like actually, let me try making this clock a little bit smaller as well. I think it's a little bit too big. So I'm going to take this down a little bit. I'm going to make this 160 pixels. And this hand is going to be... Actually, let me start up here. So I want the clock to be 360 pixels in width and height instead. So I'll start with that. Now the problem is this hand is off center now. And to fix that, I'll move the hand to 160 pixels from the left. And 160, is that right? No, I want 180. And then I want this to be 20 pixels from the top. There we go. So that's that's too small. I'm just gonna make this a little bit smaller. There we go. Okay. I've noticed something else. Is that this is 30 pixels from the top left, whereas this is 20, but that's okay for now. Now I want to try making this clock a little bit darker. So I think I covered this yesterday, but this is a color here, and these letters represent the amount of red, green, and blue in the color. So if they're all equal, you're going to get a gray. And I can change these to, I can just play with these numbers, get a darker gray. The closer they get to 0, the darker the gray gets. But I think actually I prefer it at about this. Well, this is not perfect, but it doesn't have to be perfect. So now let's try adding that animation back in, now that I've got this in the position I want it. So I can uncomment this animation. Oh, that doesn't look any good. Actually, I should mention what these what this slash and star is, and this slash and star. So this is what is called a comment, and you can see that when I add the slash star slash, that this line turns gray. And the reason is that when you add this, what you're telling the computer is that, well, this line isn't actually intended to be used. I'm just leaving it there so I know that I know how to use it again, but I don't want this to apply when we're rendering the page. So if I gray it out by putting these characters around it, then the animation isn't used. Whereas if I take these characters out and try again, then the animation is used. Of course, the animation looks terrible. So I think what I want to do is, instead of fading it in from the left, I want to fade it, or slide it in from the right. So let's remove this negative, because remember, the negative of a translate X is the left and the positive is the right. And maybe actually, instead of just X, what I can do is translate, which lets me provide both an X and a Y, so sort of a horizontal and a vertical translation. Now let's translate it in from 0, from 10% to 0%. You know, honestly, I don't think I needed this animation. I think this is going to look fine without the animation. That's okay. I've spent some time playing with the animations, so you've hopefully seen how they work. And right, this doesn't look good at all. Actually, let me try one more thing. I'm just going to try getting rid of the translate and just scaling and fading and this animation is way too slow. Okay, another thing which I probably should do is I should stagger these animations. So instead of starting them both at the same time and having different lengths, I should start this one after this one is almost finished. So the way I can do that is by adding another piece of information to this animation property. I can add a delay, it's called. So just to cover this animation property again, so the 2 seconds is the amount of time, the duration of the animation. This is the timing function. This is the name of the keyframes. And there's one more thing I can add, which is a second number, which is the amount of time between when the page loads and when the animation starts. So if I add 1 second here, well, this is an interesting conundrum. I want the animation to, I don't want to use the delay, because once the animation finishes, then it goes back to whatever it was before the animation started. And if there's a delay, then the keyframes don't actually come into effect until after the delay finishes. So let's rethink this. What we can do is we can add more keyframes. So I can say, instead of, I can add a 50% keyframe. In fact, I think I can do 0%, 50%. There we go. So let's make this a little bit shorter. we go. Well, I think getting somewhere here. Maybe I want to add some text here as well. But you know what? This is I've already been going for 30 minutes, and title of this video is Learn Something About Programming in 30 Minutes. So let me just recap what I've done, and I'll keep going on this tomorrow. So basically, all we've covered in this video is how to make animations using the animation property, which again you can find more details on MDN. So if you search for MDN animation property, you'll see documentation for what all of these numbers here do, and also the transform property. Transform lets you do all these things like move things around, scale them, rotate them, and using these and using different keyframes, we can make some reasonably complex stuff. So thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll get back to you. Follow me on Twitter and leave a reply there. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.